Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of rural Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1893, and the small township of Ravenholm, Massachusetts, had experienced one of the harshest winters in living memory. Nestled between the Berkshire Mountains and the winding Housatonic River, this logging community of barely 400 souls had always been somewhat isolated from the industrial progress sweeping through other parts of New England. The Whitaker estate stood 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, perched atop a gentle hill that overlooked the valley below, a once grand symbol of prosperity now fallen into disrepair. It was on February 17th of that year when local postman Silas Merritt noted something peculiar. In his twice-weekly rounds to the outlying properties, he observed that no smoke had risen from the Whitaker chimney for at least 4 consecutive deliveries. The matriarch of the family, Cordelia Whitaker, had been widowed the previous autumn when her husband Gideon succumbed to what the town physician described as a wasting illness of unknown origin. Left alone with her husband's cousin Ezekiel and the family's longtime housekeeper, Millicent Thorne, Cordelia had become increasingly reclusive. "I knocked 3 times, Merritt later stated in his deposition to County Sheriff Augustus Harmon. The curtains in the front parlor moved slightly, but nobody came to the door. There was a strange smell coming from somewhere near the house, like meat gone bad, but somehow worse." What followed would become one of the most disturbing investigations in Massachusetts history, though few outside Berkshire County would ever hear the complete details. The case files, partially preserved in the state archives in Boston, were subsequently microfilmed in 1962 and then largely forgotten, filed away in a sub-basement of records deemed historically insignificant. It wasn't until Professor Abigail Montgomery of Miskatonic University discovered a reference to the case while researching 19th-century rural dietary practices that the story resurfaced, albeit briefly, in academic circles. According to Montgomery's notes from 1964, published in the obscure Journal of Historical Anomalies, but never widely circulated, the Whitaker case represented a profound example of how isolation and grief can distort human perception and behavior beyond recognition. Her research was abandoned when the university declined to extend her grant, citing concerns about the unnecessarily lurid nature of her inquiries. The winter of 1893 had been particularly brutal on those living in rural areas. Food supplies dwindled as roads remained impassable for weeks at a time. The Whitaker property, situated as it was on the outskirts of an already remote community, faced the additional challenge of Cordelia's apparent inability to manage the estate's affairs following her husband's death. Gideon Whitaker had been a successful lumber merchant in his prime, but the family's fortunes had declined considerably in the decade preceding his death. The mansion, once staffed by a half-dozen servants, now housed only the 3 remaining occupants, rattling around in rooms that grew colder as coal supplies diminished. Neighbors, few as they were, reported that Cordelia had become strange following her husband's passing. "She started coming to church in her wedding dress," Martha Pendleton, wife of the local minister, told Sheriff Harmon. "She would sit in the back pew and mutter to herself throughout the sermon. Sometimes she would laugh during prayer. The last time we saw her was just after Christmas. She asked my husband if the body truly houses the soul, or if the soul might reside in other parts. When he attempted to provide spiritual comfort, she interrupted to ask if he thought consuming food blessed by a minister might provide spiritual nourishment as well. We didn't think much of it at the time. Grief makes people say odd things." When Sheriff Harmon finally decided to investigate the property on February 23rd, he brought along Dr. Jeremiah Frost, the town physician, and 2 deputies. Their report, preserved in fragmentary form in the county records, describes approaching the house around midday. The Whitaker property showed signs of severe neglect, Harmon wrote. Several windows on the ground floor had been boarded from the inside. The front garden, once meticulously maintained according to locals, was overgrown, even accounting for the winter season. Deputy Collins noted that the lock on the gate had been fastened with a chain from the inside, requiring us to cut through it to gain access to the grounds. What most disturbed the men was the silence. No birds sang in the trees surrounding the property. Even their horses seemed reluctant to approach, pulling at their reins as the men tied them to the front gate posts. The smell became noticeable about 20 yards from the front door, Dr. Frost's medical report states. Initially, I identified it as decomposition, though there was another quality to it I couldn't immediately place, something acrid and almost cooking-like. Upon reaching the porch, the smell had become nearly overpowering. Sheriff Harmon knocked repeatedly before trying the door handle. Finding it unlocked, the four men entered the main hall of the Whitaker home. The interior was cold. No fires had been lit, despite the February chill, but not as cold as the outdoor temperature would suggest. The smell was stronger inside, emanating from somewhere deeper in the house. The main hall appeared largely undisturbed, Deputy Walter Reed noted in his supplementary report. Furniture remained in place, though a thick layer of dust covered most surfaces. What struck me as unusual were the multiple locks installed on the inside of the front door, 3 new deadbolts in addition to the original lock, all recently installed based on the fresh scrape marks in the wood. The dining room, located off the main hall, presented the first truly disturbing scene. The large mahogany table that dominated the space was set for dinner with the family's finest china. 3 place settings were arranged around one end of the table. A centerpiece of dried flowers had been positioned in the middle, the blooms long since withered to brittle husks. Each plate contained small piles of what appeared to be jerked meat, Harmon wrote. Despite the cold, there were signs of insect activity around the food. Most disturbing was the ledger book open beside one plate, which contained what appeared to be a meticulous inventory written in a shaky hand. Dr. Frost's examination of the ledger revealed it to be a record of meals consumed over the previous 2 months. The entries began conventionally enough: potato soup with ham bone, preserved peaches from cellar, last of the salted beef, but gradually became more concerning. January 3rd, second toe, left foot. Millicent refused her portion. January 9th, 3 strips from right calf. Millicent still refusing to partake. Ezekiel says the hunger is spiritual, not merely physical. January 15th, finished left hand. Pain considerable but manageable with laudanum. Ezekiel says we are becoming more of ourselves through consumption. The implications were horrifying, yet the search party pressed on through the house, calling out for any occupants. The kitchen revealed further evidence of disturbing activities. Large cooking pots had been recently used, with residue still clinging to their interiors. A butcher's block in the center of the room bore deep-cut marks, with dark stains soaked into the wood despite attempts to scrub it clean. The most alarming discovery was a collection of crude surgical tools arranged neatly on a side table, Dr. Frost wrote. A bone saw, several knives of various sizes, and a set of pruning shears had been cleaned and placed alongside bandages and bottles of medicinal alcohol. Having treated Gideon Whitaker during his final illness, I recognized several instruments from my own medical bag that had apparently been stolen during my visits to the house. It was in the cellar that the full horror of the situation became clear. Deputy Reed was the first to descend the narrow stone steps, lantern held high to illuminate the darkness below. His shout brought the others rushing down to join him. The cellar had been transformed into something between a larder and a surgical theater. A heavy wooden table stood in the center of the space, with leather straps attached to each corner. A drainage channel had been crudely chiseled into the tabletop, leading to a bucket positioned on the floor below. The walls, once used for storing preserves and root vegetables, now held shelves lined with jars of cloudy liquid in which unidentifiable objects floated. Millicent Thorne was found seated in a rocking chair in the corner, Harmon reported. She appeared to be alive but unresponsive to our questions or presence. Her clothing was stained but intact. Examination by Dr. Frost revealed that she was in a state of profound shock, severely malnourished, and suffering from exposure to cold. The housekeeper's physical condition, however, appeared largely intact, in stark contrast to the two other occupants of the house. Cordelia Whitaker was discovered in the master bedroom on the second floor. She was conscious and, according to all accounts, eerily calm when the search party entered. She sat at her vanity table, brushing her hair with her remaining hand. Her left arm ended in a carefully bandaged stump just below the elbow. Her nightgown covered most of her body, but Dr. Frost's subsequent examination would reveal the horrifying extent of her self-mutilation. The subject has systematically removed significant portions of her own flesh, his medical report states. The left hand and forearm have been completely removed, along with several toes from both feet. There are methodical excisions of tissue from both legs, primarily from the calf and thigh regions. All wounds show signs of cauterization and amateur medical attention. Despite the extent of these injuries, the subject appears to have taken great care to avoid major blood vessels and to prevent infection. Most disturbing was the discovery of Ezekiel Whitaker in an adjoining bedroom. Unlike Cordelia, he had not survived the ordeal. His emaciated body lay on a bed covered with a clean white sheet pulled up to his chin. When Dr. Frost pulled back the covering, the men were confronted with a grotesque tableau that defied immediate comprehension. The deceased had been systematically dismembered, while apparently still alive, Dr. Frost wrote in his most clinical tone. Approximately 30% of the body's soft tissue had been excised. Despite this extensive mutilation, evidence suggests survival for weeks during this process, with older wounds showing significant healing. The cause of death appears to be a combination of blood loss, infection, and organ failure. When questioned, Cordelia Whitaker spoke lucidly but expressed ideas that indicated severe psychological disturbance. She referred repeatedly to the transformation and becoming whole through division. She explained to Sheriff Harmon that after her husband's death, Ezekiel had become convinced that true unity with loved ones could only be achieved through literal consumption. He had always been interested in spiritual matters, she reportedly told the sheriff. After Gideon passed, Ezekiel found an old book in the library about communion and transubstantiation. He became obsessed with the idea that we could keep Gideon with us by consuming parts of him before burial. It started small, just a single piece we divided between us while Millicent prepared the body for the funeral. We felt different afterward, connected in a way I'd never experienced. According to Cordelia's confession, transcribed by a horrified Deputy Reed, the 3 remaining residents of the house had initially survived on stored food as winter deepened. When supplies began to dwindle in January, Ezekiel suggested they continue what they had started with Gideon. He said we could become a true family unit, Cordelia explained, that by giving parts of ourselves to each other, we would never be alone again. Ezekiel went first, offering a small piece of his shoulder that we roasted with the last of the onions. I joined the communion the following week. Millicent refused, but she helped with the preparations and the afterward care. Ezekiel said she would understand eventually. The most chilling aspect of Cordelia's testimony was her apparent belief that this act of self-consumption was a form of multiplication rather than diminishment. She repeatedly referred to feeling her husband's presence more strongly with each communion and described experiencing memories that weren't her own after consuming portions of Ezekiel. "We are more whole now than we ever were separate," she told Sheriff Harmon. "I contain Gideon and Ezekiel within me now, 3 souls in one vessel. When the hunger returns, I feed it with another small piece of this temporary shell." The pain is clarifying. It marks the boundary between before and after. The legal proceedings that followed were conducted largely in secret. Cordelia Whitaker was declared insane and committed to the state asylum at Danvers, where records indicate she died less than a year later from complications related to her self-inflicted injuries. Millicent Thorne never spoke again, according to hospital records from Worcester State Hospital, where she resided until her death in 1911. The Whitaker mansion remained abandoned for decades, the locals too superstitious to purchase the property, despite its eventual rock-bottom price at auction. In 1937, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the main structure, leaving only the stone foundation and cellar walls, standing as a grim reminder of what had occurred there. Professor Montgomery's research in the 1960s included interviews with a few elderly Ravenholm residents who still remembered the whispered stories of the Whitaker family. One particularly telling account came from Harold Pendleton, son of the minister who had last seen Cordelia at church. "My father never spoke of it directly," Pendleton told Montgomery, "but once, after too much communion wine at Christmas, he mentioned that Mrs. Whitaker had found the ultimate perversion of his teachings. He said she had twisted the notion of 'this is my body given for you' into something monstrous. He burned all his theological texts on transubstantiation after that winter and never again offered communion in both kinds." The true horror of the Whitaker case lies not merely in the physical acts committed, but in the logical progression that led three seemingly normal individuals to such extremes. The investigation revealed that Gideon Whitaker's wasting illness had likely been arsenic poisoning, administered gradually by Ezekiel, who had been harboring both religious delusions and an inappropriate attachment to his cousin's wife. The progression from metaphorical communion to literal consumption represents an extraordinary breakdown of social taboos, Montgomery wrote in her unpublished conclusions. The isolation of the house, the extreme winter conditions, and pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities created a perfect storm for shared psychosis. Most disturbing is the methodical nature of their actions. This was not frenzied behavior, but deliberate, planned, and recorded in meticulous detail. Dr. Victor Ramirez, reviewing the case for the Journal of Historical Psychology in 1968, proposed that the Whitaker incident represented an extreme form of folie à deux, or in this case, folie à trois, in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one dominant personality to others in close proximity. The power dynamics in the household created fertile ground for Ezekiel's disturbed ideas to take root, Ramirez wrote. The physical isolation mirrored and reinforced their psychological isolation from normal social constraints. The final pages of Cordelia's journal, recovered from the vanity table where she sat awaiting discovery, perhaps provide the most unsettling insight into her mental state. The handwriting, initially neat and controlled, deteriorates as the entries progress. February 10th. Ezekiel has gone quiet since yesterday. The transformation is nearly complete for him. I fed him a spoonful of broth made from the last piece he gave to me, a circle completed. He smiled and said he could taste himself coming home. February 15th. Millicent refuses to help with the dressings now. She cowers in the cellar and won't meet my eyes. I changed Ezekiel's bandages myself, though it was difficult with only one hand. The hunger spoke to me in Gideon's voice today. It said soon we would all be one. February 17th, someone knocked at the door today. I watched from behind the curtain but did not answer. The outside world cannot understand what we've become. Ezekiel no longer speaks or moves, but I can feel him watching me through his remaining eye. The hunger is becoming insistent again. February 21st. I dream of a great feast where the guests consume their own limbs while smiling. They pass plates to each other, offering the choicest morsels of themselves with genteel courtesy. In the center of the table sits a creature made of many people, all joined together, speaking with many voices in perfect harmony. When I wake, I find myself gnawing at my bandages. February 22nd. Ezekiel has stopped breathing, but I still hear his voice. He says the transformation is not complete. The true communion is yet to come. I will set the table tonight. We will all dine together one last time. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence was found in the kitchen pantry, where investigators discovered a large crystal bowl containing what appeared to be a stew made from various human tissues. The bowl had been carefully covered with a lace doily and labeled with a small place card reading simply, "Family." Local newspaper accounts of the incident were deliberately vague, referring only to unspeakable acts and ritual violence discovered at the Whitaker estate. The Boston Globe published a single short article on March 3, 1893, mentioning a disturbing discovery in Berkshire County, but provided no details beyond the commitment of an unnamed woman to Danvers Asylum. The case might have been entirely forgotten if not for Montgomery's brief academic interest 7 decades later. In 1969, when the last of Montgomery's research materials were being archived following her retirement, a graduate assistant named Clayton Werner reportedly became obsessed with the case. According to departmental records, Werner traveled to the remains of the Whitaker property and spent several days excavating the cellar ruins. He was discovered by local police digging frantically with bloodied hands in the soil beneath where the kitchen had once stood. He kept saying he could hear them talking under the ground, Officer Raymond Sullivan told the local newspaper. Kept saying they were still hungry after all these years. Poor fellow had to be sedated before we could transport him to the hospital. Werner's academic career ended with this incident. He spent 6 months in psychiatric care before disappearing from public records. Rumors among Miskatonic University staff suggested he had relocated to a remote part of Vermont and lived as a hermit, refusing all contact with former colleagues. The land where the Whitaker house once stood remains undeveloped to this day. Local real estate listings still refer to the 3-acre plot as historically sensitive, a euphemism for a site too tainted by its past to attract buyers. Occasionally, curious teenagers or amateur ghost hunters venture onto the property, drawn by distorted versions of the story that have evolved over generations. What makes the Whitaker case so persistently disturbing is not merely the physical acts committed, but the coherent belief system that developed to justify them. In her final analysis, Professor Montgomery suggested that the true horror lay in the logical progression that carried 3 individuals from conventional religious metaphor to literal self-consumption. What we see in the Whitaker case is not random madness, she wrote, but a terrifying example of how isolation and psychological pressure can transform abstract concepts into concrete actions. The human mind, when cut off from the corrective influence of community, can create internal logics that lead to unimaginable places. The Whitakers did not see themselves as destroying their bodies, but as transcending them, creating a union more perfect and literal than any metaphorical communion could achieve. The journal entries, medical examinations, and witness testimonies paint a picture of a gradual descent into shared madness. There was no sudden break with reality, but rather a series of small steps, each one only slightly more extreme than the last, leading ultimately to horror. This progressive normalization of the unthinkable may be the most disturbing aspect of the entire case, the way in which the human mind can adapt to and rationalize increasingly aberrant behavior. Dr. Ramirez concluded his 1968 analysis with an observation that still resonates. The Whitaker case reminds us that the most frightening monsters are not supernatural beings, but the capabilities that lie dormant within ordinary humans. Under the right conditions of isolation, stress, and psychological vulnerability, the boundaries we take for granted can dissolve, revealing depths of behavior we prefer to believe impossible. In 1969, shortly before abandoning her research, Montgomery conducted a final interview with Josephine Thorne, the grandniece of housekeeper Millicent, who had inherited a small box of her great-aunt's personal effects after her death. Among these was a single sheet of paper, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had nearly worn through. In a shaky hand, Millicent had written what appeared to be her only comment on the events she had witnessed. They said it brought them closer, that with each bite they became more complete. I watched them diminish daily while they spoke of multiplication. I watched them consume themselves while speaking of preservation. May God forgive me for not stopping them sooner. May God forgive me for what I helped prepare. The sound of the knife on the cutting board haunts my dreams. They offered me a place at their communion table until the very end. Even now, in my darkest moments, I wonder what I would have become had I accepted. The Whitaker house is gone, its occupants long deceased, and most of those who investigated the case have themselves passed into history. Yet something about this particular horror continues to resonate, perhaps because it speaks to fundamental questions about identity, consumption, and the boundaries of the self. In the century since these events transpired, behavioral scientists have developed more sophisticated frameworks for understanding shared delusions and extreme psychological breakdown. Yet even modern analysis struggles to fully account for the methodical, almost ritualistic nature of the Whitakers' self-destruction. What began as a widow's desperate attempt to maintain connection with her deceased husband evolved into something far more profound and disturbing, a literal interpretation of consumption as union that transgressed the most fundamental taboos of human society. The few remaining photographs of the Whitaker estate, taken during the investigation and preserved in county records, show a house that appears entirely ordinary, a large Victorian structure typical of successful New England merchants of the period. There is nothing in its facade to suggest the horrors that occurred within. This mundane appearance serves as its own kind of warning. The most terrible transformations often take place behind the most conventional exteriors. Perhaps that is why the story continues to unsettle those few scholars who encounter it, not because it features supernatural elements or inexplicable phenomena, but precisely because it does not. The progression from conventional grief to inconceivable horror followed a path that step by step maintained an internal logic even as it departed radically from all normal human behavior. As Montgomery wrote in her final notes on the case, the true terror of the Whitaker incident lies not in its strangeness, but in its comprehensibility. Following their reasoning step by step, one can almost understand how they arrived at such extremes, and that understanding is itself disturbing. It suggests that the distance between conventional thought and unthinkable action may be shorter than we care to admit. The road that passes by the former Whitaker property was eventually rerouted in the 1970s, leaving the land more isolated than ever. Locals still avoid the area, though few could articulate exactly why. The story has been diluted through generations of retelling, with many current residents believing it to be simply another New England ghost tale rather than a documented historical event. Perhaps it is better that way. Some histories serve no purpose in remaining vivid. Some stories, once fully understood, cannot be unheard. The Whitaker family consumed themselves in their quest for union. In doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to consume those who encounter it, a hunger for understanding that, once satisfied, leaves only disquiet in its wake. The microfilm containing Montgomery's research and copies of the original investigation was reportedly damaged in a storage facility flood in 1973. The few published academic references to the case were largely dismissed as sensationalistic historical footnotes. By the time digital archives began preserving such materials in the early 2000s, almost all primary sources had been lost or destroyed, and yet the story persists, passed from one researcher to another, a whispered case study in how isolation and grief can distort human connection into something unrecognizable. In the end, the Whitakers achieved a kind of unity after all, bound together not by consumption, but by the terrible story they created, one that, like a cannibal feast, both nourishes and sickens those who partake of it. Listen closely in the silence of your room. That faint sound, is it merely the house settling or something stirring within you? The hunger for connection, for union with others, remains one of our most human drives. The Whitakers simply took it to its most literal extreme. They ate themselves to become whole. In telling their story, perhaps we do the same. But the story of the Whitakers doesn't end with the discovery of their macabre family communion. The aftermath rippled through the small community of Ravenholm in ways that would alter its character for generations to come. Sheriff Harmon, who led the investigation, reportedly struggled with insomnia and alcohol dependency in the years that followed. His official records became increasingly sparse, and he retired from his position just 2 years after the incident, citing health concerns of a personal nature. Dr. Frost, the physician who examined the Whitaker remains, became oddly preoccupied with questions of consumption and identity. His medical notes from subsequent years reveal an increasing interest in the body's ability to incorporate foreign matter. He began conducting private research on tissue regeneration and the theoretical limits of self-healing. His colleagues noted his growing isolation and peculiar eating habits. He would only consume one type of food at a time, never allowing different substances to mix on his plate. The doctor became something of a recluse, wrote Amelia Parker, a nurse who worked with Frost at the Ravenholm Infirmary. He would spend hours staring at his own reflection in the examining room mirror, sometimes prodding at his face as if searching for someone else beneath his skin. I once found him in his office, surrounded by anatomy texts, meticulously measuring portions of his own forearm with calipers. Frost died in 1899 of what was officially recorded as acute gastric distress, though rumors persisted that his body was found in unusual circumstances. The attending physician, Dr. Samuel Graves, refused to provide details to the local newspaper, stating only that some knowledge serves no public good. Frost's medical journals were reportedly burned at his own request, specified in his last will and testament. The two deputies who accompanied Harmon and Frost to the Whitaker estate took different paths following the incident. Deputy Collins left law enforcement entirely, relocating to Springfield, where he became a successful hardware merchant. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed, though his wife later told Montgomery that he refused to eat at dinner parties and would only consume food he had personally prepared. Deputy Reed remained in Ravenholm, but developed what his family described as peculiar habits. He became obsessed with food preservation, maintaining an extensive cellar of canned goods that he would rotate and inspect daily. Most strikingly, he refused to share meals with others, including his own family. His son, interviewed by Montgomery in 1964, recalled, "Father would prepare our food with meticulous care, measuring each portion precisely. But he never ate with us. He said mixing at the table confused the boundaries. None of us understood what he meant, but Mother insisted we respect his wishes." The Ravenholm community itself underwent subtle changes in the wake of the Whitaker incident. Church attendance declined precipitously, with many residents expressing discomfort with communion rituals in particular. The local minister, Reverend Pendleton, altered his sermons to focus on themes of community and collective identity, avoiding any theological discussions of transubstantiation or spiritual consumption. "Our town developed certain unspoken rules," recalled Edith Merritt, daughter of the postman who first raised concerns about the Whitaker estate. "No one discussed the incident directly, but its influence permeated our customs. Shared meals became uncommon outside immediate family. People stopped bringing food to funerals. The annual Harvest Festival, once centered around a communal feast, was replaced by separate family picnics held at a distance from one another." Perhaps most telling was the town's relationship with food in general. Ravenholm, once known for its traditional New England cooking, became notably austere in its culinary practices. Recipes were simplified, ingredients rarely mixed. A survey conducted by the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1915 noted that Ravenholm residents consumed significantly less meat than neighboring communities, with many households adopting near-vegetarian diets without religious motivation. The linguistic impact was equally subtle, but pervasive. Phrases involving consumption or incorporation fell out of common usage. School records from the early 1900s show that teachers actively discouraged metaphorical expressions like devouring a book or absorbing knowledge. One teacher's note, preserved in the county education archives, admonished a student for writing that she had taken in every word of a lesson, suggesting instead that she simply had listened carefully. The most comprehensive analysis of the Whitaker case's psychological impact came from Dr. Sophia Velez, who reviewed Montgomery's research notes in 1967 while developing a framework for understanding collective trauma responses. Velez proposed that the Ravenholm community had developed a containment response to the horror they could neither fully acknowledge nor entirely forget. What we see in Ravenholm following the Whitaker incident is a community-wide restructuring of boundaries, Velez wrote. Unable to process the transgression of fundamental taboos, the town unconsciously reinforced the barriers between self and other through ritual avoidance of sharing, mixing, or consuming together. The horror of the Whitakers' literal merging drove the community toward metaphorical separation. This separation extended beyond food and eating habits. Architectural trends in Ravenholm shifted noticeably in the decades following the incident. Houses built after 1900 featured unusually thick walls between rooms, with some floor plans eliminating common spaces entirely in favor of discrete, purpose-specific chambers. Family photographs from the period show a marked absence of physical contact, with subjects standing at careful distances from one another. Professor Montgomery's most provocative finding came during her final days of research in 1969, shortly before the university terminated her funding. While examining demographic records for Berkshire County, she discovered a statistical anomaly specific to Ravenholm. Beginning in 1894 and continuing for approximately 30 years, the town experienced a significant decline in marriages between locals, with an unusual increase in spouses being brought in from neighboring communities. This demographic shift cannot be conclusively linked to the Whitaker incident, Montgomery noted cautiously. Yet, the timing is suggestive. It is as if the very concept of joining together, of merging identities, had become unbearable to the collective unconscious of the community. The story of the Whitakers continued to evolve in the oral tradition of Ravenholm, though in forms increasingly distant from the historical facts. By the mid-20th century, local young adults exchanged watered-down versions on camping trips and at gatherings. These sanitized tales transformed Cordelia into a witch, Ezekiel into a ghoul, and the mansion into a haunted house with moving walls and speaking portraits, conventional supernatural elements that, ironically, rendered the story less disturbing than the actual events. The supernatural reimagining serves a protective function, observed Dr. Velez. By placing the horror firmly in the realm of the impossible, the community distances itself from the more terrifying truth, that the Whitakers were human, acting from recognizable human drives for connection and transcendence, merely taken to unthinkable extremes. The written record of the case might have disappeared entirely if not for one final peculiar document discovered in 1968 among the personal effects of Dr. Jeremiah Frost. Hidden in a false bottom of his medical bag, preserved by his daughter, who had kept the bag as a memento, was a small leather-bound notebook containing what appeared to be the doctor's private reflections on the Whitaker case. I have examined the remains of Gideon, Cordelia, and Ezekiel Whitaker with scientific detachment, Frost wrote, in an entry dated March 1893. I have cataloged their wounds, documented the methodical nature of their mutilations, and recorded the physiological responses to their self-consumption. What I cannot explain through medical science is the peculiar quality of preservation observed in the consumed tissues. Frost's notes go on to describe findings he deliberately omitted from his official report. According to his private observations, tissue samples taken from Cordelia Whitaker's remaining limbs showed unusual cellular activity. Cells from areas where she had consumed portions of her husband and Ezekiel displayed what Frost described as a hybridization of cellular structure, neither fully her own nor fully other, but something intermediate, and, by all known principles of biology, impossible. Most disturbing of all, Frost wrote in his final entry, dated October 1893, are the dreams that have plagued me since handling these samples. I find myself seated at a great circular table. Across from me sits Gideon Whittaker, though he is somehow also Cordelia and Ezekiel simultaneously. They invite me to partake of a meal that I recognize as consisting of my own flesh already removed, though I feel no pain or absence. We are not destroying, they tell me in three voices speaking as one. We are solving the greatest human problem, the illusion of separation. The notebook ends abruptly with a scrawled question. What if they were right? Montgomery's final report to Miskatonic University, submitted days before her funding was terminated, attempted to place the Whittaker case in a broader anthropological context. She noted parallels to various cultural practices involving ritual consumption from symbolic communion to historical accounts of medicinal cannibalism in European folk medicine, where body parts were consumed for their perceived healing properties. What distinguishes the Whittaker case, Montgomery concluded, is not the act of consumption itself, which has precedence across cultures, but the systematic application of this practice to the self. They sought transcendence not through consuming the other, but through offering themselves to be consumed, a perversion of sacrifice in which the boundary between sacrifice and sacrificer collapses entirely. The land where the Whittaker mansion once stood has remained vacant for over a century. In 1982, a development company purchased the property with plans to build a small residential subdivision. Geological surveys were conducted, architectural plans drawn up. Workers arrived to begin clearing the overgrown site, and within a week the project was abandoned. The development company cited unforeseen structural challenges with the site, though no specific issues were documented in their public filings. A former employee of the company, speaking anonymously to a local historian in 1994, offered a different explanation. The equipment kept malfunctioning whenever we tried to dig near the old foundation. 3 separate excavators broke down in the same spot. The project manager spent one night in a trailer on the property and refused to return the next day. He quit without giving notice, said something about hearing chewing sounds in the walls all night. The property returned to county ownership due to unpaid taxes and has remained undeveloped. In 2001, the Berkshire Historical Preservation Society proposed designating the site for archaeological study, but withdrew their application after 3 board members resigned simultaneously without explanation. Today, the Whittaker property appears on no tourist maps of the region. Local residents give directions that carefully skirt the area. Hikers in the nearby woods occasionally report finding the remnants of the old foundation, though GPS coordinates taken at these supposed sightings never match up when others attempt to locate the ruins. The most recent documented visit to the site occurred in 2010, when true crime blogger Zachary Morrison attempted to locate the property for a series on obscure historical cases. His final blog post, dated April 12, 2010, described finding what appeared to be the remains of a cellar wall partially obscured by vegetation. He posted several photographs of weathered stones and what might have been the remnants of a drainage channel carved into a flat rock. Morrison's concluding paragraph reads, "Standing on the site where the Whittakers enacted their disturbing ritual of self-consumption, I'm struck not by horror, but by an unexpected sense of loneliness. The wind through the trees sounds almost like whispering voices, and for a moment I understand the terrible logic that might drive someone to believe that the boundaries between self and other are illusions to be transcended. If you could truly incorporate another person into yourself, would you ever be alone again? I've collected some soil samples from the site for analysis, though I'm not entirely sure what I'm looking for. Something about this place makes me wonder if some traces of their presence might linger, not as supernatural haunting, but as something more fundamental, a changed relationship between matter and identity." Morrison posted no further updates to his blog. His social media accounts went dormant shortly after. According to public records, he currently resides in a small apartment in Burlington, Vermont, where he works as a night security guard at a storage facility. Attempts by fellow bloggers to contact him about his experience at the Whitaker property have received no response. The most profound legacy of the Whitaker case may lie not in the physical location or the historical record, but in the questions it continues to raise about identity, consumption, and the boundaries of the self. In an age of organ transplantation, cellular therapy, and microbiome research, the line between self and other has become increasingly complex from a scientific perspective. The Whitakers, in their isolated madness, glimpsed a terrible truth that modern medicine approaches from a different angle. We are not as separate from each other as we believe. The true horror of the Whitaker case with Dr. Tulle. Velez, in her final analysis, is not that they went mad, but that their madness contained a distorted reflection of fundamental human questions. What constitutes the self? Where do we end and others begin? How do we reconcile our desire for complete union with our fear of losing individual identity? The Whitakers answered these questions in the most literal and terrible way possible. But the questions themselves remain, buried in our collective unconscious, like the foundations of that house in the Berkshire woods, unseen but undeniably present, shaping the structures we build above. For the few scholars who have encountered the complete record of the case, the story of the Whitakers serves as a dark mirror, reflecting not supernatural horrors, but the uncanny logical extension of human desires for connection, preservation, and transcendence of individual limitations. It reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not those that emerge from beyond the boundaries of human experience, but those that arise from within those boundaries, speaking in familiar voices and acting from recognizable motives. The family that ate itself has been largely forgotten by history, absent from textbooks and official records. Yet in that very absence lies perhaps their most disturbing achievement. They have been consumed by time, incorporated into the body of human experience, present not as distinct entities, but as a lingering question about the nature of consumption, identity, and the permeability of the self. In this sense, their transformation continues, their communion extends beyond their physical remains, and their hunger, the hunger to transcend the boundaries that separate us, remains undiminished.